hello everyone. While we wait for Terry to come, I just wanted to go over a couple of points on the exam. We will be releasing the grades soon, hopefully by tomorrow, latest, maybe Friday. But everyone did great, basically. What I do have a couple of comments, and you will see that these are related to points that we deducted in some cases. So for instance, we know that the prompt may be long to read, but it's there for a reason. So we ask that you read the prompt carefully so as to address every part of the question you're asked. So for instance, if we strongly suggest that you use free authors in your answer for an essay, you should really bring up free authors and discuss them in some length. If we ask, for instance, that you respond to only one question out of a subset of 4 questions, and you need to specify that, please specify the question that you're replying to, because we may assume that you're replying to a question, and we might be wrong. Or you might be trying to respond to all questions at once, in which case you will have issues, and that's just something to think about. And then you'll see once we release the grades that there are some point deductions for late submissions. Remember, there were different end times for this exam depending on whether you were a non-native speaker of English or whether you have a disability. So we took that into account. We're not deducting points from anyone who had a time allowance and submitted their exam on time. And just in general, for the case of essays, I personally, but I would like to say this more generally, I recommend that you go over the file that we have on Canvas on how to make papers more coherent. I mean, you can apply those guidelines to not just long papers, but also short essays, like the ones that we are requesting for this kind of exam. And because being able to make papers coherent may not necessarily be the focus of this course, but it will help you tremendously in your academic and professional life. So those are my comments. I don't know if the rest of the TAs have any comments on the exam. Sophie?
Yeah. So I graded IBs for all of you, and you all did well on IBs, but I just want to let you know about my criteria in grading. So for some concepts, there are like more than one important scholars related to that concept. For example, American exceptionalism. If you only engage with Lipson, it is totally fine, but you are lose 1 point by not engaging with Tocqueville, which is also a very important scholar related to that concept. So that is how I graded these. So if you lose 1 point or 2, just keep that in mind that you probably didn't engage with enough scholars related with that concept. Well, my criteria is basically if you mention 2 names is enough. I just give you the full score, but like if you only mention 1, I just you will lose 1 point. So that's it.
Well, very useful. Any questions anyone wants to raise in the exam based on what you've heard? I'm sure we'll be getting individual.
Oh yes, for sure.
Okay. We have number 1 on the agenda is student presentations. I think they're going to be few, and that's okay, just because they're few. On the other hand, the option is there if anyone else, like our example of you're the Baton Rouge man. Okay. He's the only person who said, I'm thinking of possibly doing a paper, and here's an idea, and there may be others like that. And the idea of Baton Rouge, I then responded and said, this is big stuff. That this is, and so that is the looking for ways that these big abstract ideas come down and work in practice in one town that you may know, or one place where you may do some ethnography, even if it's not precisely because it's not your home, like going to a police beat meeting or seeing how Chicago unions will build new coalitions. Turn this on. Back up. Is all interesting stuff. Okay, so if there are other students in the class who want to, you weren't here Monday. Why don't you just say 1 minute worth, so at least that's on the agenda that others will know about your paper, your MA draft.
So I'm working on a MA project focusing on utilizing the ideas of scenes and buzz, stuff that we read about, and applying that to nightlife, or the idea of night economy in China, because as China transitioned to a more sort of service and oriented economy, less like industrial development settings, service and amenities and consumption is becoming increasingly important, and there's been this policy turn in China towards developing night scenes, developing the night economy to increase consumption and fostering the idea of nightlife culture. And I think the idea of scenes and buzz really cuts into the idea of sort of analyzing a certain urban setting and seeing sort of what aesthetic values and meanings give rise to sort of why people come and consume at these places, and that will help illuminate sort of how policies are made, because traditionally cultural policy in China has been oriented more towards a state-oriented direction, which is more top-down, and they take into account less of the local distinctions and varieties of sort of why certain places are meaningful to certain participants and not. So I hope that the concepts that I'll be mobilizing will sort of shed light on this bigger issue, this policy turn, and on the sort of the nightlife scene especially. So it's vaguely what I'm doing, still working on the detail. Yes.
So this degree of tremendous change to focus away from producing widgets, Apple computers, gloves, dresses, and exporting to the world as the base of the economy, and for telling people consumption is immoral. Don't do it. I mean, that can come from communism, it can come from a search for economic development, it can come from American Puritanism. We're not a cafe society. Americans said 20 years ago, say 30 years ago. Look at Starbucks today. Okay, so there's still people who say that, but they don't say it very loud. And that, so that okay. Comment 1. Comment 2, that last line, they don't say it very loud, is the bigger theme that is now more popularly discussed under the heading of diversity. That's really a more contemporary label for what we call in the course ethnicity and race. Ethnicity and race links it with a longer past, but in terms of the two headings of our sessions this week and in the next couple of weeks, we have student presentations. All right, we're going to have a small number of very interesting student presentations. We're looking forward to that, but we're also going to look for a couple of other things to bring in. I will say a few more, that I can always talk about, multiple things, but I'm trying to respond to the interests of the class and the activities, most of all, of those of you who are really doing active work, or a BA, an MA, or a course paper idea, or whatever. And so you get first choice if you're doing something. We're building that agenda and scheduling, and we'll be in touch with those individuals, and that's working itself out well. You heard the comments on the exam. You'll get back reports very shortly. Anything else that anyone wants to add to these sort of agenda-like points, or anyone else have an idea, a hint of an idea that might be a series of memos or a paper they want to try out right now? No. Okay. Let me briefly cover the three readings in this section, as this is our sort of reading base, and then move out and we can go further or further from there. Joseph Yee was the original teaching assistant when we first started this course, and he was a very talented Korean who grew up in Korea till about age 12. His father was a dentist, moved to Orange County. They either Orange County or maybe north of LA. Then later on he was in Orange County. But basically, the LA area. He went to Berkeley for college. He came here, did a PhD in political theory, not sociology, political theory. So he read Plato, Hobbes, Hegel, all kinds of things. But then he wanted to join this with what's happening around us today. So in this course, and then looking for both his MA and his PhD, basically saying, the parties are changing. Political parties don't have the legitimacy they used to. They've got to do new different things. And who has legitimacy, especially with young African American men? 8 to 30, let's say. These are the people who are potentially very important in changing cities, changing themselves, engaging in self-definition, fighting with each other. Their sisters more often get along well with their mothers. They don't know, we're talking relative, generally class, lower status African Americans. The boys don't know their fathers. They don't get along with their mothers, and their mothers and their sisters go to the Baptist church together, sing gospel, and that's fine. He doesn't. He may join a gang. He may feel isolated and lonely, and look for something else. So Joseph said, where do these people go? How can they be engaged emotionally, intellectually, career-wise, meaningfully for themselves and for society? And he found 4 things that young African American men were doing. They were choosing in large numbers. And they were, first of all, martial arts. Asian inspired, so then has a long section, and that's the title of the book. God and Karate on the South Side. Sorry, that's the karate part. Second part is God. Evangelical churches were number 2. These guys would often go to, maybe not the first round, they might go to one Jehovah's Witnesses church, or they might want to go to one so-called storefront where there's only one minister who was unaffiliated with the next storefront, because those 2 guys didn't get along, so they each had 20 or 100 or 600 or up and down. And there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of these around the U.S., Africa, England, and other places. And they variously link with other activity. Oh, so evangelical, martial arts. Amway is a direct sales organization based on personal contacts that people often have with each other who refer to one another. It's sort of like Mary Kay Cosmetics for women. Amway is a more general sales organization. I think it's Japanese organized or funded, whatever. But it engages, okay, I'll stop there. The 4th is Soko Gakkai, which is a Japanese Buddhist organization. Roughly spelled like that. There's a big, nice church on the, let's say, temple on the south side of Chicago, a relatively African American area. And the point, but it's Japanese organized from the background, and nationally and internationally. But roughly 40% of the members in all four of these things, I think these are at least New York, Chicago, LA, roughly 40% of the members of these are African American, usually men. But so they're active for African Americans, but they're still a minority, and they aren't the top leaders. The top leaders tend to be Asian. So there's a sense of Asian, Korean, and Chinese martial artists, and Amway, Soko Gakkai. The evangelicals are more often indigenous and often African American, but even they're not always, such as not always as you know, there are all kinds of big, mostly little evangelical groups all around the world. With Korea, again, some ways in the lead. That is, the Koreans, I think, the Koreans at least per capita, the Koreans have more persons, more people who are working as ministers, as travelers, as persons who are saying, join the Jehovah's Witnesses or join the Mormons. And they go to Africa, they go to parts of Asia, and they travel around the world, and they do this for 2, 3, 4 years on a quasi-full-time basis, basically the way American Mormons do themselves. Okay. We would bring in some people from each of these four organizations to class. When we had an evangelical there and someone who was saying, I was a prostitute, I took drugs, I hated myself, and then I found God. People in the class, you shouldn't do this at the University of Chicago. This is not USC material. So we had good discussion. Dialogue is the old USC college slogan. Dialogue. Okay. So Joseph loved it. All right. He's now writing papers on how the evangelical churches inside North Korea are changing national North Korean government policy. How's that? Okay, he finds a niche. Okay, anyway, I shouldn't say a niche. That is, he finds things which you wouldn't think can be done. You think of Genghis Khan and Jesus Christ meeting on a hill. You know? All right. Or at least Moses. Okay. Joseph worries about things like that. And so he's got chapters, he has a chapter on each of these four organizations, on how they work, the underlying values. And here's one bottom line, is that these are basically old-style, good American individualism combined with egalitarianism, combined with achievement, which you read about in Lipset and in Elazar a couple of weeks ago. But they're not presented as American values. They're presented as martial arts. Did you do your homework last night? I was busy last night. 10 push-ups. So, and a more authoritarian, Asian in color often style, but there's something on the board, and maybe they don't come from the Bible, maybe they come from Asia. They're sort of the same as the Ten Commandments, but nobody quite knows. Depends on the martial arts studio. But the point is, moralism is taken as something which the master imposes, and violence is not what you're being taught. You're being taught discipline, and most of all, self-discipline as a moral self-control set of values. This was articulated in courses at the USC, in martial arts activities, and then once a year they had a sunrise morning ceremony right here on Lake Michigan, led by a professor of sociology, dean of the college, named Donald Levine, passed on just a couple of years ago. But he was one of the leading martial arts organizers in the entire world. Okay. So, I'm giving you a quick overview of why it's an interesting study to read and how it links with politics, the changes. That is not to say, perhaps as some say, why aren't there more of you coming to my art museum? In a sense, who's going where? Are they going to art museums, or where are they going? And then let me follow them and see what there is about that place that's exciting. That's basically what Joseph did. So he doesn't say participation is a problem, or the agenda at the police organized meetings isn't interesting or doesn't bring out enough people. The question he says is, where are citizens going of their own accord? And why? And what are the issues which interest them if they're different? And they may not be different. That is, I've been involved in several of these things in Bronzeville-related activities, for instance. And so we'll often have a different new organization being put together. We're going to do really different new stuff. And then we get to the agenda. Everybody, each person says, yeah, I'll make a list. Here's the agenda. We've heard it before. So it may not be any different than what you're studying in your team meetings, but does it feel that it's different than if it's the Chicago Police Department at the lead? Okay. So the doll I talked about a little bit, gave you the main points. The last one, Rufus Browning, Dale Rogers Marshall, and David Town. This was initially a study of 10 cities in the Bay Area, circling San Francisco. And what happened in the late 60s. And the bottom line was that in the late 60s at Berkeley and across the US and many chunks of the world, you had the emergence of calls for more unions, especially by municipal employees, who were previously legally not permitted to have unions. And this was sort of fought out in these years. And so places like Chicago, we had no unions except for the bus drivers. For 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, there were no unions in the city of Chicago for municipal employees. The private companies had unions, but not the city of Chicago or the governments affiliated with it for the most part. The quick answer is, Jane Byrne created so much conflict with municipal employees that they unionized. And so they became very much more important as political actors in the city in conjunction with fighting with her. Dorothy Tillman as organizer with Martin Luther King, Jesse Jackson then were confronting Jane Byrne all the more on racial issues, and that in turn led them to find Harold Washington to run as mayor. He in turn won, and that in turn overturned much of the traditional political machine practices which had dominated the city. So we now have a mixture of multiple rules of the game in the minds of different aldermen, different civic groups, different neighborhoods. So you can find all kinds of things if you tour around. All right, so if that's a quick one-liner, two-liner on Chicago. In the Bay Area, the background was the opposite of Chicago. In the sense, Chicago was the old political machine. Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, legitimated the sense of hierarchy, of organization, follow the leader, don't ask questions, vote the party line. The Bay Area in the state of California was founded in the 1890s in an era of reform government. Teddy Roosevelt was president. The Constitution of California said, you may not have party affiliations on local, you know, if you're running for a city as a city council member, you must, I think you have to be nonpartisan and at large. That is, you can't, I'm not sure exactly, there's so-called, there are three elements of, or 3 or 4 elements of so-called reform government. Partisanship versus nonpartisanship. So partisanship means the party is listed on the ballot. Nonpartisan means you only have the name of the candidate, no party. Partisanship. At large means you have a candidate for the entire city versus a ward election, where one ward will elect. So in Chicago we have 50 wards, 50 aldermen, but they're elected on a nonpartisan basis, legally. Third is large, nonpartisan. Civil service. Do you promote government staff based on civil service exams, or do you promote them based more on seniority or clientelism, basically? So clientelism is these were developed as legal structures, a reform package that ministers and others went around the country and said, you know, we must reform our local governments, we don't want corruption, we don't want clientelism, by which they meant the Irish machine politics of the sort that was emerging in New York, Chicago, and Boston. And in places like California, the reform package was embraced, as well as in many smaller, mid-sized, suburban, growing towns. And we have basically that today. That is, we have a mixture of these legal and political cultural differences in different regions of the U.S. in ways that they are still fighting one another. More on that. Okay, so within the 10 towns around San Francisco, in the late, sorry, let me add one more linkage, which I left out. Number 4 is the city manager. You can have a strong mayor or a weak mayor. If you have a weak mayor, you tend to have a strong city manager, who is a professionally appointed civil service person, a government staff, not a politically elected official. Okay, so, and the slogan there is there's neither a Republican or a Democratic way to pave a road, just a good way to pave the road, so give it to a city manager. And so that's the ideology of the International City Management Association. Our California government was city management dominated government for the 20th century, until the late 60s. Then you had calls for more women to participate. There aren't enough women members in the City Council of Oakland. For more African Americans, for more Hispanics, and for more people who are more diverse than these engineers who were city managers. And basically, in something like 6 of the 10 towns, the engineers were kicked out. That is, a new city council was elected with more women, with more African Americans, with more Mexicans, with more political activists, and they in turn fired the city managers, and they had a more openly politicized government, more responsive to the groups that had the caucuses, they were usually called, that elected these groups. These were the so-called new social movements which we had across the country, across the world. Not everywhere evenly. Mr. Putin does not like them. The French do not like them. But they exist even in France and in Russia, even if they're less visible. That's the quick summary of the first volume, the first edition. They did another, I think 3 editions. The second edition had added Los Angeles. And the story they present of LA is amazingly conflictual, highly unstructured, self-interested, I mean the opposite of California good government. And so LA has become a sort of a hotbed of interpretation, reinterpretation. So there's an LA school of urbanism geographers and some others. Michael Deere was the organizer, and we've had meetings at the Chicago, the New York, and the LA School, so-called, of urbanism. And one way that the LA folks themselves describe the LA rules of the game is to say it's like the board game called Monopoly, where everybody gets a little bit of money and you get to invest it in one or another of these places as you move around. But it's like a Hollywood film, such as the film called Chinatown, which is a allegorical history of the city of LA, where water was brought to the desert, and the engineer who brought the water was really the founder of LA. So he's two characters, a sort of good and a sort of very bad character in Chinatown. And so the LA School says this is how we should do urban analysis. That is, don't write for specialists, don't write for university people, write for the general public, don't use any theory, bring in lots of emotion, lots of color. Don't worry about the facts or the details. We're not doing science. Science doesn't exist. Okay, that's the LA School. I'm not exaggerating much. I went to a meeting, I've been to meetings, multiple meetings of the American Political Science Association, American Geographical Society, it was called the Society of American Geographers, where you will have Michael Deere standing up there and saying, this is the LA School, and then 10 people in the audience will say, I'm an LA geographer, an LA political science, and you're dead wrong. You don't understand your own city. So they end up having shouting matches at these professional meetings over what is LA, what's the LA School, what is urban in LA. So even among the should-be, would-be professionals, we have intellectual anarchy. Okay. There's a book on this, where based on presentations and chapters from each of the three perspectives, which is not, it's in the urban course in the fall, basically. It's edited by Dennis Judd and Dick Simpson at USC. Of course, we had the conference at USC. All right. So the point of that is Browning, Marshall, and Tabb are linking us with Amy Hua, who wrote the book called World on Fire. Remember? What's her big theme? The tiger mom keeps order in the family. Stalin, Genghis Khan, Daley, Tito keep order in the political system. If Stalin, Daley, and Tito die off, you can have a world on fire as people start fighting each other. And that's a simple version of the story, which is not very articulated, I would say, in the book. But it's close to the LA chapter, which is there, and it is articulated, for instance, as a book by a guy at Yale. I co-taught a course with him called Contested Cities, and there's a book by John Mollenkopf on San Francisco and LA. Maybe that may be John Mollenkopf's title, but basically we have case studies in New York, San Francisco, New Haven, which basically try to tell the same story. This is a story, I would say, more specifically of the 60s and especially 70s, when we had the breakdown of the traditional, the breaking down, lamented, not yet recognized, being fought over of the Democratic Party, the strong unions, the Roman Catholic Church, versus a Republican or a city manager style of government. So we're having a transition away, but to what? And that's why I'm invoking the more vague label of diversity, because in a sense we're there now. And nobody really has a single, tight, coherent interpretation and analysis of what this is or how to make sense of it. And so our book Scenescapes is, I guess, is a tentative way of putting these, of reinterpreting these pieces. But I'm putting it out there just to mention, and I can fill in more details, but I'll have a little discussion first of where we might go with these things, as I know at least one of you had a question about Brownell, Marshall, and Taft.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I didn't write down my question. So,
Okay. Well, you can make up a new one if you have, or if you want a few minutes, we can just ask others for discussion points.
I think I see I was enthusiastic about getting to the Browning review because I saw so many correlations with the Tiger Mom and World on Fire sort of examples. But
Okay. That's my point.
yeah, definitely. But I think there's some other interesting dynamics, you know, that especially to do with like the diversity point, which is like, you know, the first chapter of the reading, right, where it's looking at the 10 Bay Area cities, and also in LA, like part of the success story in terms of political mobilization was like the, you know, liberal whites coming together with African Americans to form a new majority to then politically mobilize to say elect Tom Bradley, mayor of LA for, you know, what was it, like from 19 something to, or he was 3 terms mayor. But then at the same time, what's also interesting about that is, as you pointed out, you know, the Bay Area is a completely different world than LA. You know, and what was interesting to understand through that reading was that LA was essentially like they were trying to establish it as like a Midwest town, except with Protestantism. And so I see like the individualistic implications, like in terms of that translating into politics, but it has a different base than like the Bay Area, right?
Yes. No, I mean, LA is messy, complicated, diverse. I mean, so are probably many of the big cities of the world. But it used to have, let's say, until the 60s or so, it had an Anglo-Saxon dominant style, and that basically has been displaced. And with that gone, it's not clear what else, nothing else is clearly overwhelming and legitimate, most of all.
And the reading seemed to suggest that like the demise of Bradley's, you know, mayoral regime was in part because of a lack of like investment in some of the poorer regions of LA. There was like a disintegration that ended up happening with like race riots, like summer of violence, and essentially they were, you know, transitioned over. They didn't bring another strong Democratic candidate, and it turned out that they elected this like Republican candidate who was, I forgot what the word was, but he was like a masqueraded Republican. He might have been more on the Democratic side.
I think it was Riordan, R-I-O-R-D-A-N.
Yeah, Riordan.
And one more little paper I did was on, then a couple of papers on LA, but one was that Bradley had the city council strongly backing him, and they were in favor of business growth, that sort of idea, more profit, more growth, and they were not favorable toward much environmental protection. So the environmental activists organized, and they said, you know, Southern California is one of the beautiful spots of the world. We must protect our beaches, our mountains, and so forth. And they elected 4 city council members who were among the strongest city council members behind Bradley. Bradley then reversed his position, and he became an environmentalist because he saw that the citizens had changed, or the citizens had actively engaged. And so We in turn, the co-author of the paper, senior co-author of the paper is Edward Goetz, G-O-E-T-Z, who was working for Dianne Feinstein's Environmental Commission at the time in San Francisco, and basically showed in 5 case studies of LA, Seattle, San Francisco, Boca Raton, Florida, and one more, I forget what it was. 5 case studies and 4 national comparative studies, we found the same basic story, which was basically very similar to what I described. That you tended to have local governments being less environmentally sensitive than the citizens. The citizens organized, they made noise, they voted in new city council members or new mayors directly, and the government changed. The new piece of the analysis which we added, which fits with the later kind of new political culture kinds of themes, is and so forth, is the old organizations. When the old organizations don't respond, they may lose out and die. But if the city council and mayor changes, once the environmental organizations have won, their person is in place, the environmental organization may in turn may not die, but it may decline in activism and so forth. So the idea that civic groups are not always there or always, I mean, do we have legitimate civic groups, or do we have business domination, or do we have ethnicity? That is, it depends. It depends on the context and the degree of legitimacy, which is another way of framing the degree of representativeness or legitimation felt by the citizens. If there are enough citizens who are angry, who feel we're not being represented, they'll vote in somebody else. They'll work with these new social movements until they get someone. But then, if they get someone they want, then the social movements may decline.
Okay, so that's I remember that. So that's like a kind of a...
This point, just for the reference, this point is in the chapter of the Urban Innovation book, which may or not be on the list here, but it's there.
So there's like a coincidental event, or like coinciding event that's taking place in both like San Francisco and LA, which is like the more diversified that it get, and but in that diversification materialize in the form of like electing diverse council members, electing a diverse mayor, the more the diverse civic group disintegrated, to the point where essentially like in San Francisco or like in the Bay Area, right, like the liberal whites and African Americans like didn't necessarily mobilize. Latinos were kind of some latecomers, and then the inclusion of Asian Americans as well too. But in LA, that sort of disintegrated with the Bradley mayorship. How do we like make sense of the fact that essentially in how it declined was there's way less activism now, right? Like way more that expression of like trying to kind of implement some of these more pluralistic sort of laws, or like laws that are going to like look out for a more diverse set of people. There's like less of like a unified base supporting that.
Maybe you're looking in the wrong place. Where should you look that you're not in what you just said?
The arts, the coffee shop,
social media. Social media have replaced the neighborhood associations, the people who are walking around and putting flyers underneath the windshield wipers of automobiles, the people who are knocking on the door, say, will you remember to vote for the mayor? That's on social media today. Trump doesn't have a political organization at all. He uses Twitter. So I'm not saying it always works, and clearly it's messy, it's volatile, it's very hard to measure, but don't leave it out. Yeah.
Professor, but I also understood that it was kind of also the leveling principle, in the sense that these groups emerge to fight the hierarchy, and as the hierarchy decreases, the groups decreases because it wasn't
Well, no, the groups need not decrease. That is, the groups who are against the hierarchy may decrease. But so they'll often adopt a new agenda, or they may be new groups. So you may have instead of having groups that are just against the dictator, or against the Communist Party, or against the military junta, instead you may say, now we have dog watchers, or we have environmentalists, we have bicyclists, we have LGBTQ, etc. Baseball fans. In Poland, in the first election after 1989, when they had the first non-communist controlled election, there were 300 political parties and they had they had a quasi party label, but they had names, they had programs like Beer for All or Safe Sex, as their party program. Okay, and nobody got a majority, but as you had dozens and dozens of little groups.
So it's like the Hegelian dialectic, like the thesis, antithesis makes a synthesis.
Maybe there's an emerging synthesis, but it's harder to see than perhaps in Hegel or Marx's stated theory.
But I say that
and even in Marx's writings, we don't know very much about communism.
Right.
From Marx himself.
But putting like a contemporary lens, it's kind of like Martin Luther King, like, okay, we've secured civil rights legislation, and then by the end of his life, he becomes considered more radicalized, where he's like speaking out against war and speaking out against the government instead of collaborating, trying to kind of keep that tension at bay.
Yes, but this was also roughly the era of the Vietnam War, a lot of student protests, and a lot of other things, which were so. So yes, I mean we have that, or put differently, we have more diversity, and it's harder to interpret and analyze. And I would include in that sense, I mean that aspect of Martin Luther King, which I would even join, if you will, with an NPR broadcast I heard last night, just to introduce the theme of gospel rap, or no, gospel hip hop. Gospel hip hop. It went on. They had British and American speakers, and the key example was Kanye West, who has a new recording basically about Christ and being a good Christian. And that has in turn led many other hip-hop artists to start saying, sure, I was brought up with gospel as well. I mean, those are all the songs that I learned when I was a kid, and I still go to church, and here, etc. So we're having more combinations, more eclectic mixtures. And these, even though most of the voices on the NPR interview sounded as if they were African American or African, they didn't say a word. They did mention the community once or twice, but they didn't say Black Power. They didn't say, this is an ethnic movement. Their focus was on ideas, theology, liturgy. So they had ministers. They had a fellow who was a doctor of theology, guy at Park West University here, etc. So my point is, these new combinations may be primordial in the sense of race, class, gender, national origin, or they may be not. They may be based on new choices of types of music, types of shoes, types of hairstyle, types of things which skateboarding, which I may voluntarily pick up, and those may be the bases of the Polish political party, or the Brazilian organized groups which are electing new folks. So things are. Life was simpler when we had a simple left and a right, and the dictator and the people.
So I think then instead of a dialectic, it becomes a dialogical. in the sense that it's like competing tensions that are often like negotiated.
And if it were just two people having a dialogue, that would be nice and easy, but we've got dozens and dozens, and often they're going on different social media sites simultaneously, and we're talking millions of people.
Right.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Or put differently, it would be, that is the reason there's not a good coherent social science simple theory is because life is more complicated, I would say. So our solution is not for us to try to make life less complicated. We can't control that. Our responsibility is to try to capture what's really going on in life. And so do poets, novelists, reporters, media people, political or would-be political leaders, social activists, and everybody else. But we may be trained, each one of these types of persons has a different set of expertise. I didn't say explicitly artists, and each may have something powerful and additional which they can bring, and so my answer is so much the better. Let's try to use multiple sources, not just any one of these, which may have worked pretty well in the past, but may just not work so well today. And it's just to repeat my slogan, so you will remember: race, class, gender, national origin, and age explain about 10–15%. So it's there. It may be even less now, but that's the interesting background for what do people talk about in the police beat meetings, or why are the unions working with the neighborhood groups? Okay. All right. And so, the questions were, I think, useful to link link the readings with what I said, with the more general background in the course, and with the broader historical context, which is important not to forget. Other questions, comments? Some of you have been a little quiet. Let's have a. I can talk more about. How's that time here? Maybe I should. That is. But if we have another question or comment from anybody. How about from young lady over here? I don't remember you said anything in class. Have you? No. Tell us a little bit about where you're from and what your interests are.
I'm from the Chicago suburb from the Northwest.
Can you tell us?
It's in Batavia.
Okay, Batavia. All right.
So it's like a little north of Aurora.
Yes.
And I'm very interested in local government. And
Why is Batavia internationally important to the world?
We used to make a lot of windmills. And we have a very large particle accelerator. We have Fermi
Fermi
Lab.
Lab, particle accelerator, physics. They have physicists who can, it used to be the leading national particle accelerator in the world for 10 or 15 years. So I and several other economists, geographers, political scientists studied Batavia in its hot days. Okay, so tell us more.
Just about Batavia or about Fermi Lab?
About your perspectives growing up, why you're here, and any reactions to the course, and maybe to what Jenny was today.
I'd say both my parents work at Fermi Lab, so I sort of grew up in that community, which was very interesting because it's a very international and highly educated community, which was strange in kind of small town Illinois. And I just assumed that growing up that everyone's parents and friends had PhDs in physics, which turned out to not be the way the world worked. But my interest is sort of I used to do a little work in physics. That was all I knew. It's a very insular community. And I'm interested more in local government.
Okay. Terrific.
Which I'm studying for my thesis.
Terrific. The BA
Yeah,
in what department?
public policy.
Public policy. Okay, that's great. I'll just mention, if you didn't know, there were papers, projects, PhDs written on Batavia by me, by Brian J.L. Berry, Doris Holla, Theodore Lowy, L-O-W-I, was political science, particularly active, and we all wrote stuff on Batavia.
Interesting. I did
Okay. There were roughly 200 PhDs working on urban issues in those days in departments across the university, and several of them were interested in working there. Okay, but anything else that is having that background? How does anything else you've heard in the course either seem to have seemed unusual or shocking or wrong, or that is you have so try to connect your own background with what you've heard here in the readings or what we discussed.
I was really interested in the part of the course where we were talking about like the different like mayors of cities, and I was interested in like the Northwest reading. But that doesn't really like connect very much to my personal background because like I've been around like a big city for a lot of my life, but I grew up in like a fairly mid-sized, small suburban town. But I don't know.
Yeah, but Norquist, in that sense, thinks like a physicist, and that he wants to solve problems. And he doesn't. He says, don't worry about the silly parties and stuff like
Figure it
that.
out.
Yeah. And so, and that he, I say, he talks like a physicist. He talks like an analyst, an engineer, but he also talked, when he presented here, he talked like an art historian. We want to make our city of Milwaukee better by having design and having a view of the church at the end of the street, so the church towers would be right in the middle of that hole in the street. We don't want any signs sticking out interfering with that view and so forth. Okay.
And then like the other thing that comes to mind is just like sort of the idea of like the world flattening a lot, especially with like technology and physics, and like people from all over the world work on collaborations that happen in Batavia, Illinois, right? Like people from all over the world, especially like the big project now is doing, and that has collaborators in like 100 countries or something. And so just like this really international element being focused on like, it doesn't really matter where they are, and like the technologies are being produced all over the world and being like shipped there.
There are many physics papers that now have 100 co-authors. It's a different world from one boss. Okay. All right, now these are all good comments. Anything else? Okay, great. Let me say a few more words moving into, continuing sort of talking around the diversity kind of theme. And there are a couple of ways we can do that. But let me add one, which is which we can relate to ethnicity. Lifestyle broadly. Narrowly it can be the relationship between poor black men and crime. But more broadly, there's a lot more involved. So let me start with that, because this is politically incorrect to talk about a little bit, or it's argued over, but it shouldn't be ignored, and it's consistent with what we're doing in this course to take on things which we can try to deal with them, even if there's sensitive issues, which some people may pay more attention to. Okay. Is crime going up or down in the U.S., in Brazil, or other countries of the world? So maybe start with Colombia. I told you when I went to Colombia, to Bogota, I was told you must sign a death and dismemberment insurance contract before we will walk through the airport with you to the car that will take us to City Hall. So right there by the airplane, I said, okay, yeah, if I die or I'm dismembered, I don't, you can have my body. and then I learned, like, 6 times the U.S. murder rate, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, is crime going up or down in Bogota? Or let's say over the last 30 years or so?
Down.
Okay.
Comparatively down. I think nationally it's going up due to the closed peace treaty.
Okay, but a whole lot depends on, your time period. So if you say 30 years, that's one answer. If you say 3 years, it may be going up because of the nationally, because of the guerrilla stuff. What did the media focus on? The last week, the last 2 weeks, generally. That is, what if I ask you the same thing for the rest of the world for the last, say, 500 years? Is crime going up, down, or the same? I was at a conference on this a couple of months ago where we had national experts on crime, and one of them presented a first paper background, which was, if we look at crimes from something like 1400 to today, when we have some data on crimes in places like Florence and Rome and Paris, so forth, crime has been basically going down like that. In the long term. However, if we look at shorter term, in the U.S., we can have, let's say, maybe the 1980s, roughly, let's say 70s. We have crime going up and escalated here. If we look at Chicago, Chicago, New York, and LA, in the last 3 years, Chicago's going up, New York and LA are more down. Although in Chicago this year, Chicago went down. So you get very different answers depending on the time period. But one question is, why this versus this? Let's say from say something like 1945 to 2010, 2020. Okay. What happened in these years, in these kinds of contexts? If you look at the literature by the people writing on crime, and I'm not a criminologist, I'm coming to this from a broader urban perspective, but I've done this with, I've presented this and discussed this with people who know more than I about the detail, and I've drawn some of this work. The main theory that the police read to and paid attention to was the so-called broken windows theory. The broken windows theory of James Q. Wilson, and he was an assistant here, got a PhD, and then he and Banfield went to Harvard, and Wilson presented this, and Wilson was Irish Catholic, and he worked with the police, and there was a police chief in Boston named Bratton. And he heard about Wilson's broken windows theory, that is, if you have people hanging around loitering, so-called, on a street corner next to a liquor store, that creates a context which encourages more crime. Or if you have an abandoned building with broken windows, it will encourage people to break more windows, to take stuff through, to steal what's behind the windows, and to do more crimes. So solution, stop the loitering, put glass on the windows. Okay, Bratton did this, crime went down in Boston. Bratton and Wilson and others saying, hey, you know, the broken windows theory, this is good stuff. And they talked about it at police meetings. Bratton was hired as police chief of New York City. It's a bigger city, tougher job. Crime went down in New York. Okay. Giuliani was generally a very tough on crime mayor. Street vendors, insensitive to protests about racism by the police and the mayor. Crime studies are continuing, but the simple publicized result was crime dropped dramatically in New York, apparently faster than in other locations across the U.S. Bratton and others claimed credit, and the broken windows theory became highly popular in the U.S. Many local police departments, at least visibly, talked about it in a and adopted it in various ways. The most visible was the hiring, or threatened by the city of Los Angeles, was the hiring of Bratton, who he became police chief in LA, and then threatened by, and then imposed a good chunk of the policies in Los Angeles, but these were then discussed and debated at professional associations of police officers all around the U.S. and many other police departments in the U.S. have played with this. Forrest Stewart was an assistant professor of sociology here who did his PhD on one neighborhood of poor folks in homeless mostly in LA, and he fortuitously began his field work a year or so before Bratton arrived. Then Bratton arrived, so he found lots of people loitering, standing around, talking in the streets. Some were selling drugs, some were prostitutes, some were talking, some were you don't know what. But there were lots of people there all the time. Okay, Bratton arrived. Several times a day, you'd have 6 or 7 police officers who'd come up at one end of the street and walk slowly down the street, and every single person who was in the street would be asked for personal ID, please. And so they'd check the personal ID, they'd look up and say, well, you know, you're supposed to be in court 2 weeks ago and you missed your court hearing. What happened? Okay, word of that spread, so people who were 50 feet, 100 feet further along started going into back alleys and they left the street. Okay, so after this happened 2, 3, 4 times, or for a few weeks, nobody was left in the streets. So the broken windows theory was get rid of the loitering, and in that sense, it definitely happened. There were people who protested. This is, what about their civil rights? This is what was then called stop and frisk. Not only do you stop, you may frisk. Do you have any, you know, guns in your pockets? Are you touching my legs too forcefully, etc.? Okay. And then to check for, are you carrying cocaine? And where might you hide that cocaine? Could be too much personally invasive. Okay, so there were protests that civil rights were being infringed upon, and these are issues that are continuing today. Forrest Stewart has published a book which shows basically the before and after of Bratton, the implementation of this in LA, and it was analogous in many other places, although maybe not as dramatic as before after with that particular neighborhood, but similar things were reported in other locations. New York and LA. How is Chicago different? What's Chicago's culture, I should ask? Tell us your name again.
Valentina.
Valentina. Valentina is studying a police beat meeting, which is what? To just tell the others what it is.
It's a neighborhood meeting between the beat cops, that are the police officers assigned to certain blocks, and the community that lives there.
Okay. And they may be monthly?
They are every 2 months, and they discuss security issues, concerns of the community, and concerns of the police officers.
Okay. This is not the broken windows theory. That is, the broken windows theory is the police are the actors, and the drug dealers and the loiterers are bad or potentially bad people. Get them off the street. The Chicago view is we are a city of neighborhoods. We have vital and active, initially ethnic groups from different countries. We have Polish neighborhoods, Italian neighborhoods, Greek neighborhoods. They have neighborhood associations, they have shops, they have tourists, they have visitors, they have local people. They're vital, they have schools, and the idea of the neighborhood school preserves that. Okay, that is, go to a school in your neighborhood. You shouldn't be bused or have to go to another neighborhood. All right, so Chicago was not receptive to this kind of perspective. And so the Chicago variation, or let's say alternative, was not to try to do this, but to try to engage the neighborhood associations in controlling or preventing crime. And this built on, if you will, what has been discussed much more as an Asian example. China, Japan have strong traditional neighborhood associations. And they would do things, especially in Japan, they would fight fires because they had little bamboo and very flimsy houses. They had pretty high density, and they had often bad fires, and trucks are, and the streets were narrow and twisty and hard to get very. So that is, you needed to have a neighborhood association that would act immediately to prevent a huge fire from spreading. So these neighborhood associations had a long tradition, and then there's been especially documented by social scientists and reports that we've read. You'd have older women who were looking over the streets from their second-floor stores, and if second-floor windows, and if they would see someone or two people down the street, who's that? What's he doing there? And they'd call, if they recognize, oh, that's so-and-so's son. Let me call so-and-so. Or let me go over and ask his mother or his grandmother, what's your son doing up? It's 9 o'clock at night. He should be at home by now. Okay, so that kind of traditional neighborhood model in Asia, in Southern Europe, in Chicago, Roman Catholic neighborhoods especially, these were stronger, said, let's have the police work with us. And the police said, for sure, we want to work with you. So the idea is to bring the police together with the grandmothers looking out of the windows and try to fight crime together. Not to just send in the cops and clear out everybody. All right, so within Chicago, nevertheless, nationally, this is a small minority position. Most cities are not like Chicago, most American cities are not like Chicago. And so, therefore, we've got some police and some police officers, some data people in the police department who are saying, let's try other things. So you've got multiple things going on even within the police department now, and it does not tell us very much explicitly, so we don't know. But this is called traditionally the Community Alternative Policing Strategy, CAPS, is a Chicago alternative to the broken windows theory. Mayor Rahm Emanuel was so-called a reformer of trying to bring in nationally, internationally important data, professional expertise concerning service delivery, especially for things like police and schools. So he wanted to move partially towards something like this broken windows model, but a piece of that, which has been used here in part, is the idea, which is also labeled partially critically as surveillance. Okay, so the question of the stop and frisk policeman is, do you have an ID? Do you have a record? And so in that sense, we have police surveillance, and the whole legal system is more technically advanced and has the potential through more computerization of information, more data shared, or simply if you only have the police and the Justice Department and then you have each police officer able to check one name with that information and say yes or no, you should come back to jail or not, or at least maybe not back to jail, but you may have missed a reminder that you should have come for a hearing, that kind of thing. That kind of big data did not exist or was completely inaccessible electronically 20 years ago. This is new because of the technical possibilities. But the converse part of that is, as far as Taylor did, if you talk to one person, two, three, four, five, the reason that people didn't stay in the street was because most of them had done something a little bit less than perfectly legal. And they were afraid that in the hands of a police officer who has a certain amount of autonomy to say how you should be judged. I mean, should you be beaten up? Should you be arrested? Should you be, say, ignored or whatever, is left to the individual police officer. And combined with the idea of this information, this could lead to maybe not wanting to get back in front of a judge with a police officer who would say you were selling drugs, etc. Okay, so there have been studies on, I mentioned Forrest Stewart's study is an ethnography of one LA neighborhood. There's a national study by a woman at Princeton whose name I can't give you from the top of my head, but it's a national survey of I think of Americans, or it may be younger minority respondents, but certainly the younger minority respondents clearly would talk about surveillance has become a new serious issue. And there's a study by a woman who was at the Yale Law School, and she worked in New York for a couple of years. She has a PhD in sociology. And she collected data on the police department, the Justice Department, the District Attorney of Manhattan, and how they worked in various neighborhoods in the Bronx as well. And basically her story is sort of between the Forrest Stewart story and the national surveys of saying a lot of people are saying they're surveillance. So she could tell you the reason that people feel that is it's true. They're being, and this grows out of Bratton and Giuliani, of stopping and frisking more people, bringing them to court, saying, okay, we'll let you go, but you have to come back in 3 months and report to, or that is, there's more integration of thousands, if not hundreds, hundreds of thousands or millions of especially younger, minority, lower income persons who feel that they are being controlled and monitored by the police system. Okay, given the American ideals that everybody can have their own gun, nobody has an ID, you can do anything you want, this is terrible. In China, nobody objects. Genghis Khan, since Genghis Khan, everybody's an ID card, and it's part of the national system, and maybe it helps fight the coronavirus. But the idea that everybody is in an electronic system in the U.S. is, all right, fascism. Okay, so these are the kinds of debates which we have, and these themes were clearly articulated, among others, by a group called Black Lives Matter, which was very active over the last 5 years in many cities, and had many big U.S. cities had many confrontations with police departments. So how police handle this? I'll give you one more Chicago example. I bike around the city. Race bikes. I also bike. I started doing this because I bike all around city neighborhoods. I take an iPhone. I stop and talk to people. It's a great way to get a feel of what's going on in different neighborhoods. Okay, so I mostly would bike on the south side, African American neighborhoods for the most part. But then I go to the north side. In the last 10 years, I would say roughly, you have more people from the south side Friday, Saturday night, most of my Bronzeville African-American teenage neighbors, 18 to 30, go to the North Side clubs on Friday and Saturday night. They don't stay in Bronzeville. There are no clubs left. Okay, as they've gone there with more strong views, okay, so let me add an important point. That's been made in a couple of other PhDs, coming in part from Bill Wilson's work. That is that the tradition, Elijah Anderson is a student here, he's now at Yale. Basically, in many African American neighborhoods, I mean, be careful in even using that term, few African Americans live the way they do in Chicago. That is, most African Americans live in neighborhoods where they're majority whites, or they have diversity of all different kinds of people. However, you can live in a place like Chicago in a 90% black neighborhood, as do I in Bronzeville. But that is a huge exception with the rest of the U.S. Nevertheless, they've been written about by USC PhD students like Elijah Anderson as if this is a world, and we should all know about it. And it exists clearly in Chicago. But the quick point to make is. Bill Wilson, we have to have a little bit of background theory. Bill Wilson basically was the leading African-American sociologist here for 20, 30 years. I worked with him closely. We had a number of students like Elijah Anderson and others, but they would study Chicago neighborhoods, especially low-income African-American neighborhoods. And they would often report high crime, lots of theft, distrust, hatred for the police, disrespect and caution about everybody else. I mean, if you're biking along, you're walking along behind someone else, they turn around and look at you immediately like that. They're worried. And that's normal because you could be shot, you could be bumped, you'd be robbed, etc. So Elijah Anderson would talk about this as sort of the style of low-income African-American neighborhoods, the culture. Okay, Bill Wilson himself refused the idea of culture most of the time the whole time he was here in Chicago. He went to Harvard, and after 10 years there, but most of all, working with Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, and then Obama, he was co-chairman of the Urban Advisory Committee of Obama when Obama was elected. He said, we have access to the presidency. We should no longer just act like an underclass or a minority or whatever. We ought to be advising the government on what they should be doing to try to help African Americans solve their own problems. We should reintroduce the culture concept. We should not say this is blaming the victim, which is what many critics of the concept of culture invoked for 20 or 30 years after attacking the Moynihan Report. So Bill Wilson basically said we should have a paradigm revolution in how we focus on and study black neighborhoods. We should use culture, we should look for cultural specific, we should look for diseases like sickle cell disease, we should look for problems such as low trust, and talk about it, study it, and try to find solutions that will make it better, because these are not just out there, they're stronger in African American neighborhoods. Okay, with that kind of background, people have been struggling for how to do this in a way that doesn't get treated as racist, and then obviously it feeds into the rhetoric and the discussions between the police, Black Lives Matter, the media, the Black Caucus, the American Sociological Association, etc., etc. And so I can't quite see the time. What's
It's
the time?
5:55.
5:55. Okay, now I'm over time. I will quit there. We can continue some of this. You can imagine, I mean, you've gotten the core, but you can see where I'm going with this. Okay. See you Monday.